Okay, all right. Please come at 9:45 and we will start at 9:45. One thing to note is that you can do the online course evaluation, evaluations.uc.edu for all of your classes, including this one, until tomorrow night at like midnight. Okay, so that's really, it's helpful if you do that. At the end of class today, I will stop class and give you a little final worksheet that I would like your input on class back from. That is an excellent time that in a few moments that we have at the end of class to do the online course evaluation for this class. So I'll try to make sure we've got class about 12:05 today. So it'll be the end of class course evaluation wrap up for this. The final logistical item is that if you bring your something unexpected happened card, you can write your name on the back and you can turn it in today and I'll give you some extra points on your raw score of your exam next week. Or you can bring your something unexpected happened card that you have not used yet this semester. You can bring it on Tuesday, the same deal. You write your name on the back and I'll give you some extra points on your final exam because you made it through the whole semester. We can turn out something crazy. You can turn it in today, yeah.
Some of us used it on our first assignment.
Some of you used it, some of you didn't. In general, somewhere between 25 and usually about 50% of students end up using something unexpected happened cards for some reason. Lexi has 2.
You'll get another one next
You'll get a
semester.
different one next semester, Andrew. Andrew's coming back from environmental studies. All right, so something unexpected happened card, final exam, overdue homeworks by tomorrow at midnight, course evaluations tomorrow. Okay, all right. So just a few things that I want to chat about today, and I feel that they're an extension of our solutions to climate change that we were starting to talk about at the end of class on Thursday. In particular, I want to talk about the interplay between science and politics, and that regulation and the movement of laws and regulatory kind of amendments through our various agencies at the national level, at the state level, sometimes at the local level, is one of our best ways of enforcing change and getting change to start happening when it comes to climate change, when it comes to pollution, when we're looking at species endangerment, when we're looking at improving quality of life and access to healthcare, and changing poverty outcomes for all kinds of people across the nation. And so science has a very definitive role to play in politics. And likewise, politics has a very definitive role to play in science. And it's good before we start to engage in the political process and start to expect things to come out of the political process to help us with the science-related problems, to understand what those roles are. And to think about if we like those roles, if we want them changed, how we can go about affecting that. Science for the People is a podcast done out of Canada that looks at using, again, scientific information to actually help people and apply it to their daily lives, whether it's better products, whether it's in environmental health, whether it's healthcare, but they have this awesome graphic that I just love to use. All right. I mentioned that the spotted lanternfly was something that was approaching as a problematic invasive species, likely due to climate change within our region. This is the spotted lanternfly. It is a wasp-like insect. It is not it's a beetle, as my understanding, or a fly rather than an actual moth or butterfly in terms of its taxonomic identification. Currently, it exists in Pennsylvania. They've seen it in Boston and in certain places in Michigan already. It has not come to Ohio yet. It is an invasive species brought over very recently from Asia. It feeds on the sap of a variety of different species, including everything from trees all the way through flowering plants, fruit-producing plants, vegetable-producing plants. That tree is covered in spotted lanternfly.
It looks like a butterfly and bee got smashed together.
It does. Like, they're kind of pretty, but I don't let that fool you. Okay. Yeah, Willow.
So how did they get over here? Like they came from Egypt, do they know how they got over
They probably came over in a shipping or packing crate, whether it was like food products or it was lumber or some other commercial products. It's definitely a hitchhiker and accidental introduction. But they've gotten established because they don't have any natural predators. Their population tends to explode very rapidly once they're introduced to an area. They have a lot of possibilities for eating, so they're not tied to any one particular species. A big problem with them not only is that they act kind of like aphids in terms of damaging plants and removing being sat, but then they excrete honeydew, this really sugary fluid as part of their effluent, and it promotes the growth of a variety of types of mold, particularly city mold, which then becomes really problematic for fruits and vegetables. And there are all kinds of pictures of this mold growing at the base of plants that have been infested with these organisms, and then that gives them long-term problems in the field in terms of agriculture. So if you see one, you're supposed to call the DNR and tell them that you have seen such this bug in our region, and they will start the appropriate preventative measures to try to make sure it doesn't get out of control.
Should you kill it?
You should, like you should grab it, stick it in a baggie, call the DNR, and be like, I found this at this spot. Go back. Yeah, like here.
Not my job no more.
All right, they're expanding their range here in the United States as they start to slowly migrate. They're not great flyers, but they do have the ability to move, and so as they spread out in Pennsylvania, they'll definitely become problematic in Ohio in the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, all right. So the first thing I want us to do is to make sure that we have in our mind the consequences of climate change, both in terms of what we have already seen as well as what the predictions are for the future. So turn to your neighbor and see if you can list an environmental, an economic, and a social consequence of climate change. What has it done to us? What might it do to us in the future? Look at these last 2 lectures that we talked about.
Right. It can displace like, a lot of animals, like from the Arctic area.
It can, and by the, remember like the crop, how long the growing season is for crops, and then like some animals are starving because they missed the window. And I think like the extremes in temperatures, the swings, and then economic.
The growing season's not as long, so we can't grow much food, so the farmers aren't making as much money, and so businesses themselves, the goods aren't making them.
And also economically, we're gonna have to face like more expensive solutions the longer we let it go. And then
Socially, we're losing our shoreline, so vacation.
it affects recreational things, it affects communities having to move.
Communities having to build up things too.
Right.
That's a potential
Yeah.
solution.
Yeah, I think we did it. Did we do it?
I think so.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, that was
easy.
Yep.
These are the easiest peeling clementines ever. Oh my gosh. Are these special clementines made to peel with no effort? They're amazing.
And they are really nice. I think they're like perfectly ripe.
Because I would eat them all the time if it were just like
I
that.
know, yeah. Are these the cuties? I think they're either cuties or adorbs.
I know Kroger came out with the Kroger brand Adorbs. I'm
Right, I
like,
think
really?
they're from a
Nice
brand
try.
called,
Fire your marketing department.
Okay. All right. Give me some environmental consequences of climate change. Sea level rise. Willow. Seasons change. Caleb.
Changing habitats.
Changing habitats.
Some places.
Migration.
Some places are wetter, some places are dry.
Yeah, some places are wetter, some places are drier.
Changing
All
growth.
these things.
Changing growing seasons.
Good. These changing things. As the climate changes, the ecosystem changes, that habitat changes. Then it causes food web disruption. It causes increased competition. It causes the likelihood of invasive species to come in. We get this kind of snowballing effect. We get this positive feedback loop of change. And that's what, again, we're concerned about with climate change, is that once we reach these tipping points, once we reach a certain amount of warming that has happened, once we lose a certain amount of sea ice, once we have a certain CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, then we're committing ourselves to the full extent of change that might happen. What are some possible economic consequences?
More money in the future.
Yeah, to spend more money dealing with these consequences in terms of changing agricultural productivity, sea level rise. What else?
Agriculture, farming, moving and shipping, all that stuff could hurt the economy, or hurt the economy in some places and help it in others.
Good. Again, this idea of change, and that we need to be forward thinking in terms of where we are planning to plant species and what farmers should be anticipating in order to deal with it in the future, not just next year in terms of normal kind of climate weather variability, but long term in the next 25 to 35 years. What species are they gonna need? What fertilizers, what kind of pesticides can we anticipate their need for?
People are gonna have to move in certain areas.
Good. We're gonna see that people are gonna migrate due to climate change, not just due to economic circumstances or violence in their particular location. But that climate change is gonna be one of these things that pushes people. And again, that's going to impact urbanization and urbanization patterns and the use of resources, largely again within urban centers. And then how are we going to respond to that? We built for resiliency for this. Okay, social consequences. Ecotourism will be affected. Again, these shifting places where certain habitats occur, some places will be winners and become more beautiful and more desirable to visit. Other places are going to lose out.
Didn't you say we're gonna lose some more recreational activities?
Yeah.
Skiing
Yeah.
and such,
And again, where we think of those places now is going to change or shift.
like Perfect North won't be there.
Probably.
Well, it's artificial snow anyway.
Yeah, it's some of these places that have already started to adapt to climate change with artificial indoor structures, like they're actually going to be okay.
Human migration.
Good. Some of these things overlap across these scenarios or these categories, and that as we have people moving around, as we have more people that are affected by heat waves, as we have increased national disasters, that's a strain on economic resources. It's also a strain on social resources. And to think about social networks and social networking tools, and how can they build in for resiliency for these types of situations, or not? Anybody else?
Patterns of diseases, research.
Good, I would put that under social, but again, it overlaps into economic to some degree. So again, the changing pattern and need for healthcare and our focus on different diseases, the cropping up of new zoonoses, both for humans as well as for wildlife and agriculture, are definitely something that is predicted to come out of climate change. So this is the list, I've compiled mostly from our textbook as well from these other different resources that you can pull from when I ask you a question very similar to this next Tuesday. Okay. Yeah. And it'll be worth like 8 points. And you'll be like,
Let's leave the slide up for a hot minute.
yeah. All right. Things to consider that we haven't talked about in a lot of detail, again, are the tie-ins to the water resources that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. That as climate changes, the freshwater resources in an ecosystem change too. Some places will be inundated and we'll have problems with flood. Some places will get drier and will be more prone to drought. And the places that traditionally have had these problems, again, are shifting because climate is shifting. And so it plays into even that first step that we talked about at the start of class. Something that we didn't talk about to a great extent either is this kind of big idea of ecosystem collapse. Again, that as we have shifting habitats, as we have changing precipitation and temperature regimes, that you're going to be affecting all of the organisms in an ecosystem at the same time. And that puts a lot of strain on what's happening. Those most susceptible ecosystems today are places like our tropical rainforests, our coral reefs, the Arctic and Antarctic, again, places where it's already at the extreme of what we have in terms of temperature. And so there is no place colder to move into for those organisms. The same thing with mountains, and where you often have endemic small populations that have difficulty migrating, then those are the populations and species that we should perhaps be focusing our efforts on when it comes to conservation. Or we need to be making some hard decisions about what species are worthy of conservation at all, if at all. It looks crummy. Okay, the outlook is poor. And again, that's definitely a take-home message that I want you to have from this portion of class, because I want to inspire you to make responsible change in your life so that we don't have these worst-case scenarios that play out. Again, our predictions from our best climate science looks like we are committed to some of these, that we are going to see sea level rise, the Earth will continue to warm, species will migrate, some will go extinct. But if we are responsible about our greenhouse gas emissions, we can stave off widespread human climate change refugee migrations. We can stave off these ecosystem collapses. We can help perhaps organisms to adapt and change. And in localized areas, we can find workable solutions that preserve really important ecosystems and species that we find valuable to us, either for their products they provide us or the ecosystem services that they provide. Okay. But we have to start now. Okay. That was where we kind of left off on Tuesday, was what are some of these possible solutions that we have that could really implement change. And definitely one that I want you to recognize is that all of these greenhouse climate change, or that all of these climate change problems stem from our current greenhouse gas emissions. So if we really want to be working on climate change, then we have to think about greenhouse gas emissions. Whether it's those fluorinated hydrocarbons that we use in coolants and lubricants that have a really high warming potential for molecule, but they're relatively few of them in the atmosphere, whether it's methane production from its variety of sources, or if we really want to focus on carbon dioxide emissions. Those are the places where we can actually have a big impact on a whole range of possible outcomes. All right. In terms of what is this going to cost us here in the United States, this was perhaps some of the most novel and interesting data that came out of that fourth U.S. National Climate Assessment, where they really tried to put an economic cost on climate change. And so here we see that in terms of labor costs, if we can kind of move towards fewer greenhouse gas emissions in that lower emission scenario, we'll save ourselves upward of like $75 billion, which seems like a good idea to me. You know, I would talk about this. I like taxes. I like paying taxes, but I would love to see us save $75 billion on the country. That sounds good. Definitely in terms of air quality, again, we can improve air quality concentrations and other things other than greenhouse gases, in this case in ozone. Remember, ozone is bad in the lower portions of the atmosphere in terms of an air pollutant if we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing that's becoming obvious is that as the climate warms, the amount of time that we can spend outside safely also changes. So for all of our types of jobs that involve working outdoors, as it gets too hot for them to be outside, we're starting to lose hours that they can work outside when it is dangerous for them. We're subjecting them to things like heat exhaustion and possible heat stroke. And so that affects our economic income, that affects our economic productivity. So construction, agriculture, livestock management, kind of land management in general, those are all outdoor jobs that will be affected by changing climate, by people's habits, by needing to, outside security and safety. Good job.
Good job.
Will, did you have your hand up?
Kind of answered it. I was just gonna ask what went into the labor.
Yeah, those types of jobs, yeah. And again, it affects certain sectors of our economy and not others, of course. Super. All right, so what does it come down to? For me, it's this idea of being a responsible global citizen scientist. Okay? And using the skills and information that you learn in your coursework and your daily life to make informed decisions that once you understand the science behind climate change, once you understand the science and problems that water pollution, air pollution, mining cause, then you can make responsible choices in your daily life and then also in what you do in your public life in terms of how you participate and engage with the society around you. And we, this semester, have already done that. We have already volunteered our time in places that I thought was really worthwhile. It seems like from your reflections, you thought it was very worthwhile as well, in order to start to implement and start on these types of change. And one thing that we've come back to time and time again in terms of being a good citizen and solving some of these big problems that are international or national in scale is to think about policy and politics as a possible solution. That if we put into place regulations about greenhouse gas emissions, we put into place regulations about toxic metal concentrations in water, then we can start to affect a lot of people very quickly, potentially. And so it's reasonable then to start to talk about the relationship between science and politics and how do we get these regulations in place? What is the time scale for that? What information do policymakers need in order to make good regulations? Okay. All right. So that's our learning objective for today. We want to look at the role of politics in sustainability and the role of science in politics. For most scientists, they often kind of went into science because they didn't want to be in politics. Okay? They're trying to find facts, and they see that politics is very often filled with opinions, and those two things seem to be the opposite of each other. And they are in many cases, but our opinions are formed based upon the facts that we have in hand. And one of the major roles of science then is to provide facts so that you can build up your opinions and your perspective in your world. It's only relatively recently, excuse me, within the past 2 to 3 years, that we've really seen a movement across the board in science. It's always been there a little to some extent in ecology and environmental science. But across the board in science, where scientists are starting to become greater and greater advocates for science in general, for the dissemination of correct information and the correct use of that information across society. So of course the March for Science, which happened for the first time in 2016, and there was kind of smaller marches that years after this. 2017 was probably the first kind of March for Science. An outcome of this, March, Women's Day March types of events. It was the first kind of real movement of scientists, I think, to be more actively involved in politics. And that comes with some consequences. And it means that, scientists and politicians have to change a little bit their viewpoints and usefulness of science. Okay. So political solutions are one of these main strategies to dealing with environmental problems. And there are pros and cons to political solutions. There are 3 general arenas where political solutions can take place or be enacted, can be discussed and talked about. And the first one is what we tend to think about, what I have already mentioned in class, which is the formation of laws and regulations that impact environmental science, that impact ecology, that regulate things like pollution levels, that regulate products and emissions that can be used to produce. Recognize that there are other possible political avenues that science can be a part of. And one of these is in lawsuits. And the court system, since in our kind of divided executive and congressional branches today, the court system seems to be the one that's deciding a lot of these types of issues. And that you can bring a lawsuit about environmental regulations to say that this is not a strong enough regulation, or this is actually a problem with a product that needs a regulation or policy put in place. A lawsuit is one of those political avenues that can allow for information to be brought into the public sphere, that can allow for both companies to be held accountable as well as individuals for certain actions that they take. Okay. Environmental groups then are another force of advocacy that's bringing and highlighting information based in science, hopefully, about what laws and policies and regulations need to be in place or need to be changed that are faulty, that are currently in place. And environmental groups are very often the ones that are bringing the lawsuits that are highlighting the need for certain policies or regulations to be in place. And so, depending upon the group, different environmental groups are more focused in environmental, volunteer-based local efforts, and some environmental groups are really on the front lines in terms of these environmentally based lawsuits. They really see that bringing lawsuits is the best way in order to enact protection for the environment and people's around. Okay. All right, and Earth Day, of course, is one of the places where these 3 things tend to kind of come together. And this is the 2012 Earth Day rally in Montreal, which looks pretty robust. All right, and again, these guys work together. This is from a kind of flow chart from our textbook in chapter 24, and we're going to base some of this discussion today on some of the information in the first couple sections of chapter 24 in your textbook. Recognize that finding a problem, whether it's based on a scientific question that's asked, whether it's a lawsuit that's brought, or an environmental advocacy group that takes on a particular issue, is often the start of this political process. Once that problem is recognized, you got to do some research to figure out, is this a real problem? Who does it affect? How severe are the consequences? What would be an appropriate response? And that leads to policy formation, that based upon the research, we make a good legislation, policy decision. We make the right decision in a lawsuit that starts to restrict or enforce consequences for certain activities. But in order to do that correctly, we have to use science. We have to use the facts of that particular problem. After policy formation, that's not the end. That's usually where I'm like, okay, we got the law in the books, like move on to the next thing, and I forget the whole rest of the circle. Okay, and that's I think where we often also kind of falter is in the enforcement and the implementation of policy. And so for any policy that's implemented, then you have to budget for it to actually happen. And this is a place where science and politics really start to intersect, in that we can make a good policy decision or a good court case outcome, but then how do we enact it? Well, that takes money, and that's where the budget comes in, and the people who hold the purse strings are the politicians. Once you have the budget for it, you can implement this particular policy, and then the science comes in again, and that you have to monitor, does that actually help? Did we actually get the outcomes that we wanted from this particular policy legislation? Has something else changed? And we need to alter and adjust our policy and start back over again. Yeah.
Earlier in the semester, when I went to Columbus to the state house and all that, and I was talking to a lobbyist. It was UC's lobbyist actually who shows us around and just saying it seems so monotonous and redundant. How long does it usually take for one initiative to get through the entire process? He's like, well, if it's moving fast, about 10 years.
Yeah.
And that really kind of gave some perspective. I was like, if it's moving fast, 10 years, but that it requires patience and persistence and the squeaky wheel.
Yeah.
You just have to you have to stick with it and be persistent.
This is a place where individuals matter, where environmental groups can be advocates to keep the process churning. That, okay, you got stuck in committee this year, but next year's going to be a new legislature, and we might have to start all over again, but maybe we'll have a different group of legislators, and we'll get further along in the process. And that's an excellent point that Rebecca made, and we're going to come back. Okay, all of this works together into this other crazy flow chart that chapter 24 has for us, and I was like, okay, that's awesome. What I want us to think about are citizens. Okay, citizens can be lobbyists. Citizens can go to public hearings and use the science information that they have, or even their values and beliefs, in order to affect all the different branches of our government. Citizens can bring lawsuits. The outcome of that should be that we affect budget allotments, that we affect the laws and regulations that are put into place. Our government should be a reflection of what we want. Different groups are going to have different priorities, right? And that unless you make your voice heard, there's no chance for legislators to know what your priorities happen to be. Okay, my age group of people, when we go to the ballot box, we're voting on things like elementary education and Social Security. Okay, when you guys go to the ballot box, you're voting on very different issues. You're voting on secondary education and college debt costs. You might be thinking about healthcare costs that you're about to have to start to take on. Those are different priorities than other groups of people around the world, even within our nation, within our particular city. And that we all have to speak in order for our voices to be heard. And so if you don't participate, then the system starts to break down. If citizens don't speak, then the only people that politicians hear from are from business and industry and perhaps radical environmental groups. They all have a different agenda, and the role of a politician then is to hear all these voices and figure out which are the most prominent. How do they best represent the majority? But if you don't even speak, you can't even be represented in the minority.
You don't get to complain.
And then you shouldn't complain. Yeah, you're right. There's no error to environmental policy, Andrew says. You're right. Yeah, that's interesting. I think it would be a typo in the textbook, personally, since it's an environmental textbook. But maybe they are trying to make a statement that the system might be broken in terms of environmental policy, and that we don't have a system that's well set up to enact environmental policy. Okay, this is one of the other figures in chapter 24, and I certainly do not want you to take a lot away from this other than that we have actually enacted a fair number of laws at the national level about the environment. We have a Clean Air Act, we have a Clean Water Act. The Clean Air Act is most important for this unit because it sets standards for a bunch of these different air pollutants where we have already seen change. Because of things like the Clean Air Act, we've removed lead pollution from the atmosphere. We've reduced nitrogen, NOx compounds, nitrogen oxides from the atmosphere. We've drastically reduced sulfur oxides, sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere because of these types of legislative measures. The one that affects CO2 emissions the most are CAFE standards, are our car automobile fleet economy standards in terms of what should be the average fuel economy of a manufacturer's cars and trucks that have produced it. And as we raise that bar for CAFE standards in terms of miles per gallon that's required, then CO2 emissions go down. Where we set these standards then is in thing that's constantly changing in response to science, that's constantly changing in response to different lobbying groups, whether it's industry or environmental groups or citizens. Definitely the Endangered Species Act and the founding of the EPA are other things that have come out of the national level in terms of policy. But do note that the Clean Air Act was done in 1970 and we still have severe problems with this. The Safe Drinking Water Act came out in 1975 and yet we still have Flint, Michigan that happened. It's actually 5 years since Flint, Michigan this summer, which is like crazy.
Crazy, it seems like yesterday.
Yeah, it seems crazy. We established Superfund sites to clean up really heavily polluted sites in 1980. Okay, and yet we just keep adding sites to the list without actually cleaning them up. Yeah, Willow.
I just want to say the Soil and Water Conservation Act is actually, they do a scholarship now opportunity at the state science fair, because I won it last year. It's like that. It's like $13,000.
Holy cow, dude, that's awesome.
Soil is cool, what can I do?
I like water.
It doesn't say it both ways.
Why there's one, but it is missing. It's not missing. It's not
I
about
would go
it.
put in a review.
You should write a letter about that missing. Well, good to go. Okay, all right. So, what I want you to do is to find a partner. There could be 3 people in your group, but I have definitely enough for there to be pairs. If you desire to work on your own, you're welcome to work on your own. And I want you to answer the first 2 questions on the worksheet. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of political solutions, which you've already started to pick at. And the first question is to name one specific instance in which science has influenced U.S. policy, and I'll pop up the last slide if you want to refer to it, or if you want to. Okay, you find a partner, send one partner to the front, and we're answering questions 1 and 2.
I think
All
we
right.
figured it
All
out.
right.
Yeah.
Why is there nothing there to say in the legend?
The thing, it says, how is environmental policy?
I was about to say, maybe
changing?
environmental
So-
policy, like the.
Yeah.
Oh, it's the caption on the thing, okay. Hold on.
They should really mention that.
Let's see.
College students figured that out.
And not.
I'm thinking of like,
Oh, what's it going there?
Okay, we're answering
Emissions.
questions 1 and
Yeah.
2. Name one specific instance which science has influenced U.S. policy. It can be something from this list. It can be something else that you're aware of at the local level or the state level.
Mhm.
And then number 2, why are political solutions both good and bad?
The one I
okay. So I think the ozone one's pretty easy.
Yeah. and the super site emission ones is pretty good too.
Mm-hmm.
I thought talking about that one.
But I think like specific instance in which science had influence, so science established that there was a whole ozone layer.
Yeah. The ozone is a thing.
So established, the ozone hole established
Mhm.
by science. Science. Compel.
I got a lot.
Oh my gosh, I can't spell. Do not look at my I say typos, but spelling errors because I can't even really chew my food without overthinking right now at this point in the semester. I'm pretty sure I have an extra L, but I'm not sure. Normally I'd be embarrassed, but I just don't care.
It's all right.
Okay. Second time, the second.
Don't worry about it. Okay, focus. Questions 1 and 2.
Meant to, and what was it, they banned ozone depleted chemicals.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's easier. Why are political, particularly regulatory solutions good and bad? Okay, I think specifically the regulatory, because regulations are actually like enactments of law.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're good because regulations allow for punitive measures or consequences when not followed. Bad because, let's think on the bad part for a second.
I'll try.
Right, and so there can be fun, a lot of times, policy doesn't just have to be harmful.
Oh, wait, but I don't think that, the only reason why I don't think that.
They're good because they can enforce consequences for violations, hopefully deterring non-compliance. Bad political solutions. Now, rather than regulatory, when I think political, if people's general political opinions bias them to facts,
Yeah,
they may be unwilling to change. Because I think that's like when like political, but if it's leaning like from the left and you lean towards right, or is it going to be rejected just because the source of the facts?
Yeah, some
Political biases.
political biases, like lots of times, like politicians don't really give the correct facts at all,
Yeah.
even when they're
Mhm.
trying.
So political biases may promote closed-mindedness. And politicians may not promote the facts accurately.
Yeah. Half the time, politicians have their foot in their mouth.
Okay, I'm gonna give you a disclaimer, but what we're about to step into, I kind of have an opinion that I'm hoping will not be inflammatory to the class. Like as an example, I know that like I lean towards the conservative side of society, and I'm in a classroom full of people with a given lean to, but I think that, but I'm also not like the bullheaded, like I don't vote the ballot because of that, but I just think on certain things I lean that way, and I think from that perspective, I think from like family members and people I know who may be a little bit more so, I can really see how this is playing out, an actual application of why some political solutions aren't working. And yeah, I mean, for me, I kind of came with your class because I'm like, it's not chemistry. Yes. And I hate chemistry and I hate physics and I hate biology. And it sounds like it's more of like a social class. So we decided to do this. I'm like, I can sit through a semester of hippie. You know? So bias stereotype on my part coming in here, but it did hit on some things that were kind of outside of like environmentalism that were important to me. And I don't know, I like learning. And I can be open-minded about learning into my, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't have to be a liberal or conservative, left, right, kind of thing. It really is a lot of common sense.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest problem is the politicalization of the issue. As people go, la, 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 they don't hear.
Yeah, Morgan was like that. She had to push back on Facebook about posting about that. She's just like,
Family
members.
Right, and I think it's like, that's fine, believe what you wanna believe, I'm just saying, take, at least be open-minded, learn it, and then make your own conclusion.
Yeah.
But you closed-minded, you can't be jacket on the person.
Right.
At least you can do, read about it and learn about where the other person comes from, so at least you have more common ground to say,
Right,
and
and that's
know
what
where
I
they're
said.
coming
Morgan
from.
like, try to figure out why they're reluctant about climate change, so that you understand what you can make a decision about.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, all right. What are some good things about political solutions?
I think when regulatory means that basically regulations are enactment of law just by administrative agencies, so they come with consequences. So they have the force of law, so what I think is it promotes, well, I would think it would deter larger corporations or bigger entities from non-compliance because consequences usually equal money to affect their ability to make money if they're not complying. So I think in that regard, it's good because it kind of
Yeah,
is a big arm of influence because it affects people monetarily, so.
okay, what else? What else is good about political solutions? Cool. Brings it to the public side, what's already. One thing we've already kind of talked about. You could influence a bunch of people at one time. What else? What else is good about regulatory solutions?
Set standards and foundations for what we.
Yeah, we like to start somewhere.
Yeah.
We can see if something works. Well,
It holds people groups
yeah. What else? Yeah. Good, it should like actually help the environment. Economy, society.
This may tie into a con, but I'm thinking like backdoor, like how it brings influence to a large population. So if it's an issue, whether you agree with it or not, it may, inspire people to more critically think about the issue, to either support their argument for or against, and maybe reduces ignorance.
So that's where I think the public spotlight tends to help, that it can help inform and educate people, definitely. Anyway, okay, anything else? Good things? One thing I would say that we haven't talked about is that we can change them pretty easily. Okay, we will, they're meant to be responsive. Regulations are meant to be flexible. They're meant to be enacted quickly, so that we can address actual problems. Okay, what are some negative things about political solutions? Willow.
It takes a really long time.
I think one of the biggest cons is people hear the word political and automatically goes to where you lean on your politics. And I think some political biases can make people close-minded to even receiving facts to make a decision.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest cons of political solutions is the fact, kind of what you were talking about, the fact that there are political parties. If you agree with two of the major things on this side of the party, that's the party you're going to go with. And then you may not agree with some of the smaller things they have. So a
Right.
political solution could end up being not exactly what you wanted it to be, due to the fact that they have to comply with their particular group stance for.
They don't have to, though. They could be critical thinkers and make up their own mind. Just
So
saying.
traditionally, lawmakers, that's what we were looking for in lawmakers, was critical thinking skills, and that they would actually represent their population, that they were elected from, their electorate. Today's political landscape, particularly the national level, is very different than that traditional view. Yes, they're very focused on re-election, and in order to do that, they recognize that they have to toe a party line, even though that might be very different than their electorate. And we have, in many places, maneuvered the electorate of districts so that they don't have to worry about their electorate. Their electorate is a majority party line organization. So there's a few things that have broken down in what should be our ideal political solution today. Because we're in a democracy and that happens. Well,
Another problem is that not everyone gets their like opinion across, so not everybody votes, or like how you said, like you either get industry or you get the groups, and then those are like the two extremes for somebody in the middle.
right, like if you're forcing a new regulation and you only hear from industry about it, you might not have the full picture, and you might make a bad policy decision as a result. Dominic?
A lot of them lack consequences. Like it says they're fully fine. This happens, but a lot of times not really caught doing it.
Right, or if you know you're gonna get fined for it, you can budget for that. Okay, like we know we're gonna get caught over harvesting, we'll pay the fine, we're chill with that, okay, we're making enough money, no problem. And so the enforcement is both a pro and a con, definitely.
I think politicians too, I mean, they're not the scientists. They're not propagating like the research and the data, and they can misspeak. I mean, I know people who post ridiculous things on Twitter who are politicians, just misspeak, like maybe misrepresent facts, and then because they're not scientists.
Right, there is one national leader who holds a PhD in a science field. Angela Merkel is a PhD physical chemist. Okay,
She's not,
that's it.
she's pretty close to being done.
Yeah, she's not running again, okay, but she's led Germany for 12 years, 12 years. They have a different kind of system in terms of terms you can run, and term limits, or length of terms. It's hard to understand science, okay, there's a jargon and a lingo that goes with it. And if a regulatory person from National Marine Fisheries comes in and says, you can harvest so many metric tons of blankety blank flounder this year, the politician's gonna hear flounder, and they're gonna go, I think that's a fish. Okay, and a lot of the important parts can get lost in the communication of science to non-science literate individuals, and we as scientists fail miserably at that, right? Like we are comfortable in our speak, and we are used to talking to peers that understand us, and interacting with policy managers can be very hard and problematic. Yeah, well,
I was just gonna say, a lot of things go under the table too. So like they're not even noticed or anything. That might go to the
yeah, enforcement last time. The other thing I want to do last time. Okay, the other kind of con is that laws and regulations are easily changed. As the political party changes, they can roll back regulations, they can enforce new regulations. And so this is designed to be a responsive system, and it can take a long time for that to actually be responsive. It also means that something that has been enacted and put in place can be shifted backwards. That just as we can take 2 steps forward, we can also take 2 steps backward as part of this process. And so again, what I want you to recognize is that some of the good things about regulatory enforcement are the same thing some of the worst things about regulatory enforcement. And that the role of science then in politics is something that we need to be thinking about, considering how do we use science to better this process, and where in this process does science play a role? And so I want you to look at question number 3 on your worksheet. What is the general role of science in politics in the United States today, as you can see?
I think it's used when it supports a platform. It's dismissed when it doesn't support.
Yeah, It's being selectively
Yeah.
accepted. Which is really sad.
Mhm. You really look like you were trying to prove a point there. And then it dropped. See? Yeah. I really cannot spell.
I couldn't spell on good day, to be honest, so.
Oh, can we leave this one up for 1 second? I want to finish it.
And it'll be in the slide.
Okay.
It'll be on Blackboard.
Like the economical yes.
No,
The big goal in science.
like my parents were like, it's literally all the temple now. It's about, about how like, you can have fun. Yep. And all the cancer.
I'm
I know,
thinking,
he's like,
He's
you don't
thinking
know
out
that.
loud.
I'm thinking of the reasons
Well,
why
and it talks about how like
economically
almost
isn't
everybody in the
necessary.
world has something
Has
to
any-
say. Right. So it's really good though. I
These, okay, these types of pollutants, that persist and move around in the environment because of their persistence are really of interest to lots of environmental scientists today, because we're doing a natural experiment with ourselves as to what are the consequences of these. And with this particular compound, the suite of compounds, we've had enough exposure now to recognize they can cause cancer. And, you know, of course, if we had known that at the beginning, we would never have used them in the first place, but we did, and so now we have to deal with those consequences.
I just think that there was a lot of issues with policy.
Oh, yeah,
And stuff like that because the companies, scientists were saying it wasn't a problem with it.
Right.
Because they were getting paid to say that.
To say that, right,
There were
right.
Other scientists that were like, no, this is a problem, but they were getting over it.
You might even say, that these conflicts of interest are just as important sometimes as some of the other items. I didn't spell it right, but we get the idea. Yeah, Caleb.
Just one thing to add, but I think it's ridiculous that, you know, politicians don't go to school for something and then use that as their platform. They go to school for political science,
Right.
and that's their.
How to win an election.
How to win an election, not like, you know, somebody could run on healthcare because they went to school.
Right.
Oh, and that's why people like banks.
So like if you're interested in healthcare, he was not cut out for the political. Doing myself is very valid observation, possibly good idea, but no. Like you can do much. As soon as it's yeah. They're not gonna make you. Yeah, you know.
The majority of us ignorant little people running around the world. I'm like,
Like, he didn't annoy you, like, whether you agree or not, like, it was an intelligent conversation?
right, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, what is the role of science in politics?
It provides you with that.
Right. Okay, and let's go with like facts. Okay.
Science is the
Yeah.
truth.
So we said the general role of science is only used when it's beneficial to the political candidate. The political party.
And it's dismissed when it's not, that's exactly what we were done, so it's selective acceptance.
Exactly. It's like, they they'll accept what will help them. and what's not.
They'll reject what does not support their platform.
Sure. Well, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Science provides the truth.
We'll let that, we'll get
Science.
there. Okay, what else? What else is like, okay, so science can give us facts, but like, what else does science do in this political process? Where else should science be involved?
Judicial. It should be involved in the judicial, whether it's not something that's constitutional.
Again, but how in the judicial? What should it be doing there?
How does it determine the Constitution?
Well, it can be, there's an amendment in the Constitution that was recently, you can't pass something that's intentionally going to hurt the environment. Like with the regulation of certain chemicals.
Yeah, what has been proposed but not ratified
Yeah, no.
fully. I don't remember that from my radio labs, public constitution, thinking back. But thinking about that, so science provides facts, whether it's to the judicial branch or to Congress or to the president. We know we have a problem with that, and that then we tend to see that politicians cherry pick the facts that support their political process rather than taking them at the basis of what's actually said. How else should science be involved in politics, though? What do you do with those facts then? How would you act in a political sphere? How would you act on these facts that science gave you?
Form solutions, like they play a role in the formulation of the solution. So if the issue is, I don't know, whatever the issue is, and the data that science provides pertaining to that issue helps build the framework for the solution.
Right, exactly. The science that's provided shouldn't just be information. The science should be integral in forming the policy that should say, wait, you're cherry picking the facts here, okay? You must recognize that this other thing is possible or is a consequence so that you make a good policy, okay? And that's, I think, where scientists today are cut out of this process, is that they're expected to provide the report and then that's it. Okay, it goes to the aid and then that is done. Okay, their opinion is not asked for again after we've made a policy. Okay.
What we really need is we need a scientist who's good at talking to people.
Right.
We need a scientist that can get up on the news after they pass something that's completely ridiculous.
Bill Nye, the science
Tell
guy.
everybody how ridiculous it is.
Bill Nye the Science Guy, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Okay, Stephen Hawking was okay. All right, he had these big ideas that were very interesting to hear and hear.
He proved that God didn't exist and then disproved it.
Right, and he talked on a level that was exciting to hear because of the level of which he spoke on, perhaps more sometimes than the content was understandable. Okay, but think about how few those representatives of science are that are good at communication with policymakers and otherwise. Okay, think about where scientists today are placed within our national administration. They're not present. Okay, so how is science going to help formulate policy? How is science going to help provide facts if they're not even invited to the table? Yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
So the person in charge of the EPA,
Yeah. God bless.
are they scientists or just a politician? Or like, who are they?
The current director, acting director of the EPA is an industry representative. It's also the guy.
He's an industry representative.
Yeah, that's his whole career has been as an industry lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry.
How
No joke. Like, I'm not joking.
is that even possible?
Because he's an acting director. Okay, Trump can put in whoever he wants to be an acting director. Half his cabinet is acting. This is congressional oversight not being allowed to work.
But Trump's.
It would break down the system.
You're getting flashed.
I know. Okay. This is the type of difficulty where you have someone from a particular perspective that is going to enact policies then from only that perspective. Now, having a scientist as the leader of the EPA may or may not be better. That person has a perspective and a worldview and has a scientific background that might bias them to certain things. But we might assume that as a scientist, they would be less biased. They'd be more open-minded. They would be able to make factual decisions regardless of that bias.
Even if they have a bias, it's better bias.
Yeah, we would, well, it's more in line with our biases, right? So we like that better. Keep that in mind, okay? So science provides information to help us form the policy. They should also be involved in policy implementation, okay? Like, how are we gonna put this out? And how is this policy gonna work? Can we test that? Can we make hypotheses about that? And then the last thing that they should really be involved in is policy monitoring. Okay, like if you're gonna determine if a policy is doing what you want it to and how it needs to be adjusted, you want a scientist doing that type of research on the policy results, okay? You don't want, again, a politician that isn't familiar with data collection, doesn't know statistics, this is not their area of expertise in designing experiments to test the policy. is working well, is gonna move beyond anecdotal evidence. That's again where we want scientists involved, okay? So 4 big areas where we think scientists should be involved: providing information, in helping to form policy, implement the policy, and then monitor the policy, so we can go back to new policy formulation and kind of complete this one. Clearly today, in our current administration, the role of science and politics is broken down, and that science is not being allowed to give information, whether it's climate change related, which is a very obvious breakdown in this administration, or if we're talking about human health concerns. There are lots of things going on at the national level where we need information from scientists about the importance and safe use of drugs or new products that are coming onto the commercial scene. And scientists have to be engaged in that process for it to work. Okay. These things are particularly important when we deal with problems that are known as tragedy of the commons scenarios. These are big problems that affect lots and lots of people, where we deplete a shared resource by individual users that are acting very responsibly. Their individual actions can be very self-interested, but they're actually making a responsible decision for an individual basis. You know, like, I must commute and drive from Mason to Claremont Tuesday, Thursday, because this is where my job is, okay? On an individual basis, that makes total sense. It's bad for the environment. I have to commute, 30 miles, a total of 60, 2 days a week, okay? If I taught this class online, that would be a more environmentally responsible decision.
Or not.
Or I could ride a bus, or I could carpool with a student that is near me in Mason. I have solutions available to me that I have not taken on, okay? My individual actions make a lot of sense in terms of convenience and making money, but they don't make sense in terms of these tragedy of the commons. Politicians and their political framework are designed to solve these tragedy of the commons situations. Their scope and ability is designed to look at the whole and pick out when individuals are causing problems and find solutions for those individuals. That's where policy should really be helping us, is avoid these air pollution problems, avoid climate change, avoid water pollution, where we have non-point source polluters from across the globe that are causing problems in other places. That's where policy is designed to work. And they need science in order to formulate good policy. They need science in order to enact that policy. They need science in order to monitor that policy. Okay, I want you to answer question 4, which is the reverse question. What is the role of politics in science?
Funding.
Good, fun. We'll get there right now.
That was a good easy question.
Funding.
Okay, so totally there.
I can't think of real too much else.
Oh, politics and science.
Politics.
Like-
Funding.
Like
You can do 4
making sure
and
it's
5.
allowed to hear
Craft
to
a
do
new
that
law.
science.
Enacting.
Wait,
New law, make a new
Change.
Tell me the role of politics in science, and then new number 5, craft a
Supportive
new law.
regulation.
Yeah.
Or legislation.
new laws.
Make people more aware of things through politics, I guess.
We're going Toy Story.
So are there laws? You shall not.
That's already a law.
A new national law, I said a new national law.
You shall not kill by a law. Is that a law?
Got it.
This last
Yes, I think I
one,
did this on a wall.
new law, I think like,
President doesn't make
You had
the.
a law.
tax incentives
Yeah. Tax incentives to
that promote,
That's pretty broad.
promote,
a greener life.
that promote greener, more environmentally beneficial
Yeah.
behavior.
Yeah.
It's a working piece to take by legislature first.
So Lexi and I.
So, when people say guys, when they throw their buds out, is that considered littering or is that?
I saw, where was it?
Madison said she thinks she picked up 500 cigarette butts when we did our pickup the other day.
Oh my gosh, you go up on
Yeah.
that then too.
Yeah. And that was just in the little parking lot area
Yeah, that was at like this one.
at the beach.
When we
It
drove
was
down
nasty when
133.
we had all that snow, that was job.
Yeah.
And all the snow melted, you just see sticker butts up and down the sidewalk, like.
What am I on 32, like all on that trailing?
Oh, yeah.
Everywhere.
I'm gonna make a new smoke.
It's like if you
Yes.
saw a cigarette butt and leaving it in your car was gross, what makes you think leaving it outside is any better?
Without gum.
I know, those are cool.
I saw that, and it's like, we
It's not too much.
everywhere.
I didn't really want to get like bonded to you.
My mom's bad on that, just start going up. Can you not do that? She's like, it's not that.
My new law is banning smoking.
Okay, very quickly here, at the end of class, what is the role of politics in science? Money, that's right. We have to provide the funding and the budgeting. What else, Caleb?
The scientists can do research.
The environment, it hurts you.
Say what?
They can do the research, but they can't do anything with it.
Right. Okay. Morgan.
In order to pass what the scientists want, politicians have to appeal to whichever party is in majority power.
There we go.
Yeah, so what is the role of politics in science? So, I guess it directs. Does that make sense? Like it directs the problems that are addressed, you know, like the ruling party sets the agenda to some extent. It's listing the priority list.
With that party's ideas.
Right,
So
yeah.
they have to word it properly and make it fit to the law.
Selectively. Yeah, probably putting limitations on like what. Limit what?
on like testing and like things like CRISPR and using like what they.
Good, good. Limit, science. And that's a good, that's an excellent point, in that science oftentimes does stuff, okay? And we sometimes forget that like there's an ethical, moral aspect to this, and maybe we shouldn't. We're all like, yeah, we can, let's see if we can, let's see if it works, yay. And then we're like, oh, whoops, we radically altered all snakes for all time. Sorry. And some politics can help to be that moral conscience to science. Okay, but recognize that there are flaws in that, right? That, you know, politics changes as what they're setting as the priorities, and that the limitations they sometimes put on research and science through funding can be in areas and directions that are unhelpful to society, particularly often the environment in general. You know, they say we're not going to fund this particular aspect of science because we don't currently value it. Okay, and they forget that they take a wide breadth and range of science in order to make discoveries and things like, you know, that going to outer space has been, even though it seems frivolous, has provided us with a whole suite of inventions and products that we never would have had unless we had gone into space. Okay, anything else? The role of politics in science. These are the big ones, and I want Evgeny to recognize that the two seem to operate in separate spheres, but they actually interconnect and overcross a lot. And that, particularly for environmental science, if we really want to enact and enforce change, we have to be thinking about politics how we interact with politicians. And as we talked about, that takes communication on both sides. And when decisiveness breaks down those lines of communication, when disagreement breaks down those lines of communication, then both things suffer. Okay, science suffers as well as politics and the laws and regulations that we can enforce. Okay, all right. The last thing for you to do in class then is to complete the end of year survey that I have for you. You do not have to place your name on it if you do not want to. You get your participation credit for the other worksheet that you did today. If you are gonna hand back the worksheet that you did for me on the first day of class, if you wanna look back at how your views have changed, and if you wanna check with whatever your goal was, if you did it.
All right. Who knows?
Well, my handwriting was much neater at the
If you have
beginning of
not
the
already
semester.
done so, we'll move on class evaluation.
Okay, what? Tanya baby. Oh my goodness. Beautiful.
Yeah. You're already decided this.
Blonde.
I'm crazy in a
good way. You right, yeah. Yeah, we never answered that question.
You might have a new perspective on it.
Why is it that your future destroys nature? Because I'm just crazy. Yeah, I did think that.
No, although what I would say, like, you should probably have a response to that. You know, in that question, I'm much more interested in what you think that connection is and what, you know, what I think that connection is. But that's not what I'm looking for. What I would say is it kind of relates to the last slide that I'll pop up.
Pretty. Let's just stop forward.
Okay, Andrew asked his question on the first, the first worksheet of the semester, you know, that he wanted answered hopefully in class was, why do we humans, a product of nature, a part of nature, continue to destroy nature?
Are we destroying ourselves?
Yeah, it's a big, why are we doing this to ourselves? I think that's a huge question. I don't know that I have, you know, the magic bullet answer for that. I think there are a lot of things that play into it, that have very worthwhile reasons of why we do this. You know, we are trying to improve our quality of life. We're trying to make a life for our children. We're trying to be better than other nations or peoples or communities around us. And we're trying to survive and exist. I think that the way in which we've done that to this point has really put a damper on our continued survival or sustainability on the planet. And that the solution to that, the way that we live better, is to balance all these different things that we talked about during the semester. We have to balance resource use. We have to balance our consumption. We have to balance our politics with the facts and the science and the research that we have behind it. And once we do that, we'll act responsibly. I have lots of faith in human nature. Just like we might be the cause of our problems, we can also be the solution to our problems. But we have to act responsibly in order to do that. And that's where science comes in. It gives us information so we can act responsibly, so we can improve quality of life, not just for us, but also for the organisms around us, so we can act within our biocapacity. I'm trusting you to do that. Use the information you need. Okay, I'll take your worksheets and I'll see you Tuesday. Please remember that if you have any overdue homework, they are due tomorrow night, and our exam starts a little bit earlier than class time. Okay? Yeah, I'll take like all the worksheets. You can give them all back.
I'm going to give it to her. It literally has her name on
Does she need this first one?
I gave it to her.
Okay.
That's fine. Okay, you can put them in the stack, I'll sort them. If you have, there's something unexpected happened, card for me, please make sure your name is on it.
Did somebody just sing Backpack from Dora? I heard it. Who did it?
It was probably Andrew.
Oh my God, that's gonna be in my head for a month.
I did.
Backpack. With things and knickknacks too.
I don't even remember that song.
Sweet Dado.
I remember the map song.
Okay, so one of the kids that shadowed me
Yeah,
texted me, she's like, what's the name for Danielle's class? I wanna take it.
good, I'm glad. to do that.
I was actually thinking about using it because
Oh,
I
yeah.
didn't finish the last one. But
Oh, yeah, I think you did.
no, I turned in, so number 5, I
That's
did do
right.
number 6.
Okay, you can use it for that. Like if you want to do homework 6.
Well, something did actually happen. There was a death of a family Chris.
Yeah. Use it for that. Until you have until tomorrow night to turn it in. Hey, we can use it for that. Here, I'll take it and I'll write on it for homework 6. Right there from that. Okay. All right. Thank you, ma'am. Good, I would love to have her in class.